Well, thank you all for being with us today. Very lucky to have with us one of the U.S. Congress's leading voices on the clean energy transition, Congressman Sean Casten. I should say I've been calling you Senator Casten all day. My grandmother said I was clairvoyant when I was young, so you just keep that in mind as you're plotting out your congressional future. Congressman Casten is one of the leaders in the U.S. Congress on the clean energy transition on many different fronts, looking at how we can make or reduce barriers to expanding opportunities on clean energy, looking for ways to incentivize the private sector to embrace the clean energy transition, and not just embrace it, but create businesses and jobs that will be part of the new economy on the other side of this transition, both during and after the transition. So, Congressman, thank you very much for being with us. We really do appreciate it. To start, we're going to hopefully have time for a couple questions near the end, but I'll start with a couple of questions. Congressman, you're a champion for market-based strategies to help facilitate the transition. And what drew you to that approach of using the private sector as the catalyst to help us move to a clean energy future?
So thanks for having me. The short answer is 20 years of experience in the private sector.
Yeah.
So I was, and I don't want to do my whole resume, but my dad testified before the Senate in 1975 on the bill that became PURPA, then built the third qualifying facility in the country in Trenton, New Jersey. And so I grew up just being inculcated in the reality that it is pretty easy to build power plants that are cheaper and cleaner than the alternative that exists out there. And it is really hard to go up against incumbent utilities who would prefer that they not have to compete against you.
Yeah.
And you know, through my own career subsequently, that sort of, you know, the apple fell a long way from the tree and then rolled its way back. I would submit to you that the single most impactful climate legislation that the United States has ever passed is the 1992 Energy Policy Act, followed by FERC Order 888. Nobody talks about those, but if you understand that clean energy and cheap energy are synonymous, and the opportunities to cheap energy and the challenges of cheap energy is why we are so slow to deploy clean energy. When in the wake of 888 and the 92 EPACT, for the first time in our history, you could make money in the utility industry by undercutting the regulated monopolies. And so all of a sudden, you saw the nuclear fleet in the United States go from 60% capacity factor to 90% capacity factor because there was an incentive to run the cheap stuff first. You saw this enormous surge in combined cycle gas turbines that were displacing simple cycle gas turbines, almost doubling the efficiency because there was an incentive to build cheaper stuff, right? And we went from a grid that averaged 1,400 pounds of CO2 per megawatt hour to a grid that averaged, you know, I think now we're down to 700 or 800. This is all before the renewables transition came in, and it was all because people went after cheap energy. And then that created this enormous backlash because lots of those companies that did that went bankrupt because as you deploy cheap energy, the price of power falls, and all of a sudden the returns you thought you were going to get on that asset aren't there anymore. You know, the saying I grew up with in the power industry was that everybody wants to be the third owner of a power plant because if you bankrupt yourself a couple times, you can finally get down to an acceptable cost of capital. But all those assets have lower marginal costs. Mm-hmm. And so if we use markets, and yes, we have to find a way to make sure that people keep investing, you will preferentially deploy the cheap stuff, which is also the clean stuff. And the obstacles to doing that have always been the same. Businesses who like to make more money rather than less. If I can sell power for $70, I don't particularly want you in my market selling at 30.
Right. Well, let's talk about those incentives. You mentioned incentivizing investment, being the third in after two bankruptcies. How do we create public policies which lead to incentives to make those types of investments?
So I think utilities have a huge role here, but they need to be creative. And I'll give you a personal example. I ended up running a regulated utility in New York State. didn't want to, but ended up there. And we, as a condition of taking over that utility, we told New York State that we wanted to have an incentive to invest in efficiency, because under the traditional utility pass-through model, we wouldn't have an incentive to meet our mission, which was to profitably reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That led to, in New York State, you can still find it, it's called a lightly regulated utility model, where we were effectively a for-profit co-op, where anytime we invested in, we basically set our billing rates based on historic fuel conversion efficiencies. And any time that we deployed capital to get that up, we got a preferred return on our capital and then had to share 50 cents of every additional dollar back with our customers. That entity, within 4 years of being created, our revenues had fallen by 20% and our profits had doubled. In other words, our customer rates fell by 20% and our profits doubled, because we set ourselves up to have an alignment of interests.
Right.
And there's no reason we can't do that at the state level, at the federal level. We've got work we're doing with, let's use performance-based rate making, let's use shared savings models, let's change the incentives. We could go on and on from there, but it's not hard to say, if you are creating a pile of money, let's make sure that everybody who's involved in the creation of that pile of money gets a slice of the pie. There's a lot of ways you can skin that cat, but the current model that says anybody who connects a wire that lowers the cost at a certain point in the grid, all the benefit flows to one party and all the benefit runs away from the party who has the right to approve that wire, is a way to make sure nothing gets built.
So what is Congress's role?
So Congress at its best, which we rarely do, needs to understand the difference between being pro-market and pro-business. I go back to the 92 EPACT and FERC 888, and at that point in our history, I think if you were to broadly stereotype the two parties, the Democratic approach to environmental protection was command and control, and the Republican approach was let's use markets. Remember, it was Ronald Reagan's White House that created cap and trade and the Montreal Protocol and an international agreement to cap and trade. I mean, that sounds crazy this week when the leader of the Republican Party is attacking the UN, but that was Ronald Reagan's idea, right? And Bill Ruckelshaus and Bill Riley out of the EPA, that was further implemented in the first George H.W. Bush White House with the acid rain trading program, and everybody was saying it's going to be way too expensive to strip all this sulfur and nitrogen out of the back end of these coal plants. And that market-based solution drove the price down. I mean, I remember people saying it was going to cost $600 a ton, and all of a sudden it was $5 a ton to reduce sulfur. We are in a better world because we embraced markets. I think the challenge of this moment in Congress, to your point about what should Congress do, is broadly speaking, the Republican Party in Congress has moved to let's protect incumbent businesses as opposed to let's support markets. And I don't think the Democratic Party has done a good job of rushing in to fill that void. We've all demonized competitive markets because look at what Enron did. There's this hostility to markets and not a recognition that at the end of the day, there isn't a business in the world, including any of the ones I used to run, who comes to Washington and says, I was recently reading my freshman macroeconomics textbook, and it says that transparent information and no barriers to entry and no barriers to exit are the key to an efficient market, and it turns out I have information that my customers lack. Why am I allowed to keep this? No, nobody does that, and so I think it behooves our regulators to be the advocates for markets and competition and understand that everybody else is going to look out for their self-interest. But if we don't do that, you really quickly fall into a scenario where everybody's looking out for their own self-interest and nobody's actually looking out for the one person who truly matters, which is the consumers who benefit when you have competitive markets.
I think we just found your next campaign ad, you by the fireside reading your college economics textbook, showing to your constituents that you're always on the job. As we look to reduce emissions, we have another imperative, and that's to continue to focus on economic growth. Which market mechanisms, carbon markets or tax incentives or regulatory and compliance, what combination of those should we be looking at?
So I have always felt that CO2 is better regulated from an economic perspective than an environmental perspective. I'm not saying the Clean Air Act doesn't have jurisdiction. I'm certainly not supporting the Trump administration to go back on the endangerment finding. But CO2 is a global pollutant, and because reducing CO2, particularly in the energy industry, but it's completely plausible that you could cut US CO2 emissions by 60, 70% and save money. Because the energy industry has so much inefficiency in it, and because left to their own choices, that's what markets want to build. You know, the coal industry in the United States has collapsed, not because we all got woke, it's because coal plants are lousy investments. Mm-hmm. Renewables have surged not because we got woke, but given the choice between owning an asset that has zero marginal operating costs, selling into an uncertain power market, and then something that has non-zero operating costs, you do the others. Electric vehicles have surged because given the choice between paying for maintenance, paying for gasoline, and having crappy acceleration, and not paying for those things and having really good acceleration, that's what people prefer. So those sorts of tools, those market-based tools, I think are much more effective than economic tools or environmental tools. And I want to just give you a context, and I'm not saying you were saying this, but we have to reduce CO2 and still maintain economic growth. The United States today generates a little over $200 of GDP for every million BTUs of primary energy we consume. You know, total BTUs of coal, gas, primary energy. The UK generates $360, 200 to 360. The Danes generate over $500. The Swiss generate over $600. Because we have always had an energy policy in the United States that prioritized the economic interests of energy producers over energy consumers, we have always incentivized resource extraction at the expense of efficient resource utilization. Mm-hmm. We have handicapped our economy to the point that if all we did was deploy technologies that exist, that our trading partners have already figured out how to deploy, we could double the size of our economy with the same amount of energy use, right? That opportunity is sitting out there, and it's simply people respond to the incentives that they're given. And the incentives we've given have said, drill, baby, drill. We can do better. We can be ashamed about what we've done in the past, or we can look at this as an unbelievable opportunity to have a whole lot of cake and eat it too.
Yep. I'm going to audience with a couple of really good questions. First question, which bipartisan climate policy has real prospects in this Congress?
I don't know. And I don't know because everything that I've just described to you, particularly think about the GDP piece of it. Suppose we made a commitment to say, let's have an energy policy that transfers wealth from producers to consumers. Because of the way that our politics has sorted itself out over the last 2 decades, that's a wealth transfer from red America to blue America. John Thune represents the Bakken oil shale. Mike Johnson represents the Henry Hub. Chris Wright, Doug Burgum, they have made their money in resource extraction. All of these people have a vested interest in raising the price of gas, raising the price of oil. They are very concerned about the fact that the Saudis are keeping oil price below the levels that the frackers can compete in the United States. They're very concerned that if we don't build out LNG fast enough, the price for gas is too low for them to justify their operations. That means that anything that we do to reduce the price of energy to benefit consumers runs smack into the constituencies that the leadership of the Republican Party represents. There are exceptions. I've had some good progress with some of the members of the Iowa delegation because Iowa is very long on renewable energy and very short on demand for power. And so so we have a common interest in saying, me in Chicago, I would like my consumers to be able to access cheap power from Iowa. They would like to find a market. So we've done some work on, let's build some transmission lines that connect us up. And I think those situational opportunities are out there. But to get the leadership of the Republican Party to prioritize cheap energy is antithetical to how the Republican Party exists in Washington right now. And this isn't about like whether or not what your views on the Second Amendment or women's right to choose are the cultural issues of the day. It's just sort of the sorting of our politics that's happened over the last decade, because it used to be that the Bakken oil field was represented by Tom Daschle. You know, it's just that sort of that rural-urban split in our politics.
Well,
is
we could
positive.
go on for a long time on this topic, but unfortunately, the clock says 0. I'm afraid we're going to get the big hook in a minute. So, Congressman Casten, thank you very much.
King.
Thank you very much for your time.
you,
Really,
appreciate it.
really
Thanks
appreciate
so
you
much.
having you here. Thank you all for
Thank
coming.
you.